I'm a consultant with the Indiana IEP Resource Center, and if you don't already know, the Resource Center is part of a resource network that the state of Indiana has, so that there's always a go-to place for whatever you're looking for. So, for example, if you need resources related to autism, typically the Indiana Resource Center for Autism or the Hands in Autism program, there are places that kind of you direct right to those places, and you know that you've got the resources there. So for the Indiana IEP Resource Center, our main focus is around special education and the tools that you need to be able to provide that. So we support the Indiana IEP program that everyone uses, and now I believe everyone in Indiana that is a public school uses the Indiana IEP system. It is not without its flaws, but it's constantly being tweaked to try and make it something that is usable for everyone in the system. But we also support around other things related not only to special education, but sometimes what we do for everyone is also what's really good for students in special education. And that's where MTSS comes in. When we look at our districts who are struggling with the performance on tests and things like that for our students who are identified as having disabilities, usually when we can bring up those scores, you can also see an impact on gen ed students, on students who are identified in different disaggregated categories, students of color, students who have low income, students from a different language background. And so we know that when we do something good for the whole population, we see everybody climb. Now, what we don't always see is closing that gap. And so as we talk about some of the things that happen in more intensive tiers of multi-tiered system of support, that's where we're looking at closing gaps. But what we do at tier 1 is what brings up everyone, okay? So that's why we do a lot of training on multi-tiered system of support, because we have a lot of districts who are struggling either with those performances in different groups, but also they may be struggling with things like least restrictive environment. And how do we get more kids in that typical environment where they are in with everyone else to the extent that they can be? Because we know that more exposure to that gen ed curriculum, more exposure to kids speak when kids are learning, the conversations that happen when those core things are being taught, those things are critical, they're important. So we need that exposure to happen. And again, that's where MTSS comes into, is trying to meet everyone's needs in all the different settings they might be in, but pushing heavily towards what happens in the gen ed classroom. So we got a ton of stuff to cover today, but I want to start with just showing you a few things as far as what you have in your folders. You do have a copy of the PowerPoint with all the slides. Behind that you have, we call this a placemat, and it gives you a little bit more information about all the different domains related to multi-tiered system of support. Now, these are important because we've had RTI in Indiana for as long as I can remember. At least since I came back to Indiana, there was some version of RTI happening, response to intervention. But it didn't always go so well, right? It didn't always stick. It didn't always make the impact that we were looking for. Or sometimes it fizzled out. It would fizzle out when a staff member who was kind of running the show would leave, and suddenly we're like, okay, well, I guess we don't do that anymore. You know, some of those things just kind of dry up and disappear when that happens. So we focus very heavily on that fifth column, which is the tiers, right? We know the tiers, and we are still going to talk about the tiers today because I want to point out differences between RTI and MTSS. I don't want you to think it is RTI with a new name, because it's really not. There are lots of overlap, lots of things that are similar, but I'm going to try to point out along the way, here are some key differences from the old way of thinking to a more comprehensive framework. But we paid a lot of attention to the tiers and not so much to the other columns. So these other columns are important, and typically what we do in a training like this is we focus on the basics and we focus on the tiers, and then if you need further support in your district related to those other areas and need some, intensive team development or work, then you put in a request for us to come and support your team, because it makes more sense on a team kind of level. So you have that. Now on the right hand side is a lot of paraphernalia, right? So you may have other copies of this kind of stuff at home already. We have a brochure that just talks about what we do as a center and a lot of different things that we're responsible for providing. Also have a brochure on facilitated IEP, which you can read more about. I don't want to take a lot of time here to explain it, but we have lots of stuff on our website that will tell you more about what a facilitated IEP is. And then we added some flyers related to some things that we don't always do, but these are new opportunities that will be coming up soon, or some of these things have already started. So one is Conversations with Authors, and this is a free 30 to 60 minute, depending on the author and how much they talk, but you'll know in advance. But it's a free webinar to jump on where you are just hearing authors of some key books that we are finding to be very helpful talking about the book. It's like getting the Cliff's Notes directly from the author, plus you have the opportunity to type in questions for that person and get some concrete answers from them. But I found these to be very helpful because I don't have time to necessarily always read the whole book until I hear more about it and think, oh, I want to read that book, right? So these are all also recorded. I'd encourage you to participate live if you can carve out a half an hour when they happen. But if not, they are all recorded and are available through our website and through to the YouTube channel. The next one is the Learn and Lead cohort, and this is the third year that we have that we're going to be doing this cohort. There is a bit of a cost to it, but that's because it has some in-person opportunities as well as some webinar opportunities throughout the year. But it's with a couple of really big experts in the field related to facilitating meetings. Now, this isn't a training to make you a facilitator, but it's basically a training to tell you, you could maybe do this without a facilitator just by following some of these tips. And Julie Weatherly is a national expert on special ed law. She's an attorney, highly sought after as far as her time and expertise. But she talks about things like fatal mistakes, things to never, ever, ever do because they will get you, right? And because they're not good for kids. Like, definitely don't do this. Here are some things that you can do. So again, this is really for just about anybody who participates in meetings that wants to make them better. So you can read more about that. This one I am super excited about because I find myself talking a lot about we need to differentiate, right? We know we need to differentiate in the gen ed classroom. We need to differentiate in groups that we provide. We need to differentiate in the special ed classroom. But if you ask me to sit and totally explain it to you, I am not a teacher by background. I'm not sure that I could get a good handle on how to put it all into words, the how-tos of it. So this is a 2-day intensive on differentiation. Again, there is a cost to it. Anytime there's a cost, that means you're getting fed because our grants can't pay for food. So that's where the cost comes in. And then the last one, it's a freebie because it is a webinar. And it's not until September. And it's after school hours for most of you, unless you're coming from the central time zone, and then it's a little bit into school hours, but it's from 4 to 6 Eastern. But it's moving beyond some of the typical stuff we do to address challenging behaviors. So beyond treats and timeouts. So again, those are all just for your consideration. And if you're not interested, share these with one of your colleagues back at school. All right, so for today, you've gotten your welcome, a little bit of introductions, and kind of orientation to what the day looks like. I do want to ask, I know we've got Richland Bean Blossom here, we've got Evansville here, Pike Township here, Huntington here. Who else do we have? IPS. Anybody else? Okay, this is a good group. It's a good mix. Plus, I love when people are coming in teams. This is a teaming kind of process, right? It's based on a teaming structure, and some of the planning that we're going to do today and some of the thinking really is helpful when you do have other team members there. You may not be the right team members, right? Because some of what we're going to do today is going to be more of showing you how we would do this when working with an individual school team. Because if you're coming from the district level, you're at a different view, right? And so when we take this same kind of process and have people who are working it in the building, and you ask them what they're doing, what resources they have, what assessments they're using, you may get different answers, and that's okay. Again, this is more about the process than about what you're going to come out with on sheets today. This morning, we will go over some of the components and the principles behind MTSS. We'll dig heavily into those tiers. We may or may not get through all of the tiers before lunch, but then at 11:30 we'll break for lunch. So if you're like me, I'm on like an eating schedule, and if 11:30 hits and I don't have something, I'm going to be a little off. So we will eat at 11:30, which means you're free to go wherever you want in the area, and you'll have an hour. So we'll start back up at 12:30. We'll jump back into a lot of the other domains beyond the tiers. We'll look at some considerations for implementation, some things to think about, and then we'll wrap up the day no later than 3 o'clock. Sound good? Okay. So when you walk out of here today, I am hoping you'll be able to have some language around the benefits of MTSS, like why do we even want to put the effort in, right? Because that message has to get out there. It has to get out there to our teachers, to our parents, to our stakeholders, and sometimes to our kids. They've got to have some understanding of why do I need to do this extra stuff around the subject that I dislike the most because it's hard for me. You'll have a good understanding of what those different components and principles are, and then you also should walk away with some of the things to consider as you start to put some of this in place. I went over this already. The one thing that is on here that you haven't seen yet, or some of you haven't seen, is our Padlet. And if you're not familiar with the Padlet, it's just kind of like a bulletin board that's online. And we add to this all the time, different resources, different handouts, websites, things that are related to multi-tiered system of support. So I would bookmark this and keep it handy because, again, as we find something new, we add to it. Occasionally, we find something that has disappeared and we have to take that off and find a new resource to replace it. So that happens as well. So beyond what I had on my agenda, because that was just my agenda, what are things that you want to make sure that we cover sometime today? Questions or, We'll talk about data, and we'll talk about data in the sense of what kind of data do we need, and how do you come up with, at what point do I act, right? Like, at what level do I figure I need to fill out this paperwork or take the next step forward or things like that? So yes, we will definitely address that. What else? Okay. And we'll talk about how SDI fits into everything, but also recognizing that not every kid who has a behavior or a social problem is getting SDI because they don't have an IEP, but they're still disrupting the classroom, or they're still struggling to get access to the learning because all this stuff's going to come on in. So yes, absolutely. And if I don't hit any of these things during the day, make sure and say, you didn't fully answer my question. Dig deeper into this and I'll do the best I can. I've also got a couple of team members here with me, and would invite them to join in anytime that I'm not giving the full picture of something. Yeah, you guys come on in. There are materials in the back, and we've got a couple of people who will help you get signed in. Okay, I am going to skip this because it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I want to start with just getting a sense of what you already know. What are some things that you already know, or at least think you know, about multi-tiered system of support? Tell me anything you already know. Beautiful. The whole child, right? So just like you mentioned, there's the academics, but there's also social emotional, there's behavior. All of those things are important. And we also know that they don't tend to exist in isolation, do they? If I have behavior problems for long enough, I'm likely to end up with some academic impact. If I struggle academically long enough, I may have some social emotional things that develop out of that, or I may have some behavioral things that come from there. Yep. What else? What else do you already know about MTSS? Or keywords or phrases that you know are related to MTSS? Good. Timely, right? The support should be just-in-time support.
Tiered in nature.
Tiered, right. Multi-tiered system of support. Yes, very data-driven.
It's for all students.
Love it. Every kid, right? So I used to hear this phrase in schools a lot, and I've said it myself. I know I've said it. I think we should RTI this kid. Right? Like it's an action, like I'm going to RTI them. And it's not an action. So when we're talking about MTSS, that is one of the differences that should have never been a difference, because even with response to intervention, there was tier 1 and everyone got tier 1, right? And so you were somehow part of that already. But our thinking shifted over time to think, okay, you're not really looking at the response to intervention until we start putting some intervention in place. Well, to me, tier 1 is an intervention. We have very deliberately, as schools, tried to determine what was the best instruction we could give to students before we started the school year, right? There's deliberate planning that has gone on to figure out what we do for everyone. And when they don't respond to that, what do? As a mass, if we don't respond, we change tier 1, right? Yes. So really thinking about it's all kids, it's all staff, it's everyone. Good. Well, you already know a lot, so we can just go home now. Okay, so some things to think about that are a little bit different. We have sometimes had just some misunderstandings, some myths that have occurred. And especially as MTSS really started to become something that, a term that people were hearing more often, we just had lots of misinformation. And so sometimes you may hear somebody say, well, MTSS is about behavior, or MTSS is about academics. And that is one of the key differences to me between RTI and MTSS, is it truly is about the whole child. It's about looking at all of these things, and not just separately, but thinking about how they impact each other. So it's about everything, and it could be looking at different areas of support for students. Pendulum swings, and it's just a fad, and it's going to go away. I really don't think this is going to go away. I feel very confident that it is an evolution of lots of good things that we've been doing over the years, and it's finally taken all of the good things from RTI, from PBIS, and it has put it into a framework that is pretty widespread throughout the United States. Indiana has not been a state yet that has specifically put it into law. Like it's not a mandate necessarily, but it is part of Indiana's ESSA plan. It shows that we're going to use MTSS as a way of good practice for all students. Again, it's not a program. It's not something that you purchase. It's a way of doing business. It's a way of looking at things. It's only for students with disabilities. Well, we know that's not true. And in fact, in some schools, I've seen the opposite, where students with disabilities have not been considered part of any interventions, which does not make any sense. I want you to think logically about this for a minute. I'm a school psychologist by background, so I've had a lot of kids that, I get their packet of data, and it's, you need to test this kid, right? And when I start looking at what's gone on over the last maybe year for the student, they were struggling in something. Let's take a kid that's being evaluated for a specific learning disability, struggling in reading. So we're going to put some interventions in place, and I'm all jacked up, and this is great. We're doing interventions. I'm happy. And maybe we're doing 3 days a week of 30 minutes of some kind of reading instruction in addition to what they get in the classroom. Didn't work, right? Didn't make the progress that we were looking for. So we bumped it up and said, we're going to do 60 minutes, 5 days a week. And so we put this another layer on what the student is receiving. They're just still not making the progress that we needed. So we evaluate. We determine that the student needs special education support. So they had been getting, and it wasn't enough for them, they had been getting their reading block plus 60 minutes of supplemental instruction daily. And I've seen so many times where once we say yes to a specific learning disability, those interventions are scraped away. And instead of instruction in the classroom, we say we're going to take 90 minutes and give you special education support instead of, I have now just decreased my services in so many ways, and somehow we think that is going to be a better situation, and it's not. And we see a lot of kids in special ed who continue to go backwards. They continue to get further away from their gen ed peers, and it's not because we don't have good special education teachers. It's because we have a system that doesn't always make sense. And the explanation from a lot of schools has been, yeah, but we've only got so many resources, and if this kid's getting a different resource, we can't use that spot anymore, right? They're getting special ed support, so we're going to do something different. That's an equity issue to me. If kids with disabilities are now not able to be part of something because of their disability, that's discriminatory. So I know it's what we've done for a long time, though, and I think a lot of schools are starting to move away from that and see that these supports should be available to any student who needs them, in addition to whatever other kinds of supports are out there. You need what you need, you get what you need, and when you don't need it anymore, then we scale it back. So it's that just-in-time kind of support. But let's think about it this way. If I have an IEP, the IEP tells me any special services that I'm entitled to, right? So if it's 30 minutes of a social skills group in a, whether it's a gen ed setting or a special ed setting, that means we have to do that, right? Maybe I get speech therapy 20 minutes a week. If that's on there, I have to get that. But it doesn't say how much time I'm spending in art in recess, meeting with the counselor in a tier 2 reading support. It doesn't say any of that stuff. It just says the special stuff that we have to do by law because we have determined that's the specially designed instruction for the student. So I gently push back on those things. And I really do mean that. We can't change anything that's going on in our own systems if we go at it, head butting the wall, right? It's got to be gentle challenges and pushes to make that sustained change over time. It's just one more thing, and it costs so much money, and it takes so much time. Well, we don't get more time during the day, so it's going to take the same time as whatever else we're doing because we're still bell to bell. We've got so many minutes in the day, and it really doesn't necessarily cost money. It could, meaning there are districts that go out and decide, well, we're going to do this specific reading program as an intervention, and maybe it costs money. But it's not that MTSS costs anything more than the resources that you already have. It's more about taking everything that you do and trying to connect it. The more that we connect each and every initiative, program, person, team, all of that kind of stuff that we have going on in schools, the more that we make those connections and they share information, then the better functioning those systems are. It also helps us to figure out what's not working. The more that we connect things, the more that we determine, why are we doing this? Because I don't think we're seeing any output from this, and we need to purge that from our system. And we will talk more about that as we move on too. So again, within Indiana law, you don't really see this anywhere. There are a couple of places that you need to pay attention to. One is Indiana's ESSA plan, our Every Student Succeeds Act plan. And I think, Alicia, is the plan undergoing revision right now? Okay. Is MTSS still a part of it?
I would love to say so, but that's Jason's team.
Okay.
Kathleen's team.
Just wasn't sure. That's okay. But this graphic, it started out as a graphic that special education department was using, and I think at some point somebody just said, well, this makes sense for everything we do, right? It makes sense for everyone. And part of it is around making sure that we use all the good stuff that we know about in education. We work together, we have good instruction, we use good assessment techniques, we base it on a solid curriculum. That's stuff we know already. And in the center, and that's just blown up from the center, it's also telling us that in order to make that happen, there has to be shared responsibility. No more my kids, your kids, it's our kids. Whether we're talking about classrooms, whether you're talking about special ed, gen ed, whether you're talking about EL or English native speakers, whatever it is, they're all our kids. So there has to be that shared responsibility piece as well as shared accountability. It's if you're struggling as a teacher next door to me, we need to work together. We need to share the resources that we have and the techniques in order to make sure that everyone's doing well. And then also high expectations for everyone. High expectations does not mean that we believe that every student is going to master every standard at every grade level, because they don't. Our typical kids don't, right? But we know the important things and we keep moving them forward. And then for students who don't necessarily hit that level, it's still a matter of always thinking, I've got to set the bar high. If I don't set the bar high, kids will never reach the level that we're looking for. We have to have that good thinking about, we've got to keep continuously pulling kids, pushing kids, encouraging kids to move forward, right? And to always keep moving forward. And the center, equity and access equals outcomes. I really like this because it's not just about making things available, because when we think about equity, we're thinking about giving everyone what they need, not necessarily the same things, because all kids need different things. But we always have to be thinking about, how are our different groups doing, and are we giving them what they need? Plus, do they actually have access to those things? I've heard a lot of pushback from schools that have programs that they say is available to anyone, right? We've got after-school tutoring. It's available to anyone. But if I'm a student who I have to go straight home from school because mom's got 2 jobs and I've got little brothers and sisters and I have to make sure they get fed, or I have to go to my job, it's not available to me. If I don't have transportation, it's not available to me. So sometimes we've got some great things happening, and I don't want to tell schools they shouldn't have those things. Those things are great, but they don't necessarily end up with access for everyone. So for those kids who can't access certain supports, how do we make those same kinds of supports that they need available in a different way so that they actually do have access? Because if they don't have access, you can't benefit from something that you don't get. You have to make sure that we have that access piece there.
I do want to clarify real quick. MTSS will still be a part of the plan. I believe the graphic may change.
Oh, gotcha.
I don't want anyone thinking it's going away.
And here's where it comes in. If you look around the outside that's kind of encompassing all this stuff, you see multi-tiered system of supports, and you see universal design for learning. And those two things are, again, not very well defined in anything else that we see in our laws, or sometimes even in some of the guidance that's out there. But it's saying that if we think about how we give kids different levels of supports based on what their needs are, it logically sounds like a good thing, right? But that other piece that kind of goes hand in hand with it is universal design for learning. And again, universal design for learning has got a ton of research behind it. It is a really good way of thinking, but in some districts in Indiana, it has taken hold so well, and everything they do is based on the principles of universal design for learning. And in other districts, you may ask 10 colleagues and only have one of them that's even heard of what UDL means, right? So I will share some resources at the end of today about where can you go to learn more about UDL, because we certainly don't have time to train on that today. We do have a couple of trainers who do some sessions on UDL and on inclusive practices in general that might be something your school could be interested in. So Indiana has declared to the world, to the federal government, this is how we educate our kids. So even if it's not in law, it's in the push to say this is how we should be doing things. Another place that's it's related which it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that it's related in this way, but it's in Article 7. It's in special ed law, and it doesn't say MTSS anywhere. You can just search, you will not find it. You will not find RTI in there. But what you will find is a section called Comprehensive and Coordinated Early Intervening Services, right? It's before you get to any of the eligibility areas. And it basically just lays out that if you're going to intervene, if you're going to do some coordinated things, which is what this is all about, then here's some things you got to follow, which means we don't need permission necessarily to do interventions, but we need to notify parents. They need to have a good understanding of what we're doing, how we're assessing. And many schools, particularly with the political climate that's been going on these past few months, when they are branching into more social emotional supports, they are getting parent permission in a lot of cases because it's been such a controversial topic lately. So again, you've got to look to your district for guidance on that, and I'm sure your district is looking to their attorneys for guidance on that. So I don't want to give you advice on what to do or what not to do in those cases, but that is a good section of Article 7 to read to make sure that you're giving the proper notification. That includes a lot of kind of problematic language as far as you also have to have a statement in these notifications that says, and by the way, if we get to the end of this road and your student has not made adequate progress over an appropriate period of time, we will be recommending a special ed evaluation and we will be completing that in 20 days. We don't have a lot of schools that get all the way to that end road of truly saying this is what we think is an appropriate period of time and here is what adequate progress would be. Like many times we stop before that ending point and go ahead and do an evaluation or change what we're doing. So, sometimes it doesn't end up with a 20-day evaluation, but okay, some things that are in Indiana's SES plan as far as the guiding principles related to MTSS, and you guys mentioned some of this when we were talking before. It includes everyone, and that is different from the thinking of RTI. It really looks at the whole child, which was different than the thinking with RTI. I would also encourage you, if you have separate teams that meet on behavioral or social emotional versus academic issues, that you think about combining those teams, because when we parcel that out, we sometimes miss the picture of the whole child. And there are a lot of schools that have these separate teams. It was started for good reason, I think, but it's kind of defeating the purpose of making sure that we look from that broader lens. There's some other things that are connected here as well, that we're always trying to get kids ready for what they do next. It doesn't matter whether they have a pathway that's going to lead them to college or into a career or into something different, but we're prepping them along the way. We're making sure that they have the skill set that they need by the time that they leave us. It is very leadership driven from the point of you've got to have primary leadership on board to make this happen. It's really not a grassroots kind of thing. You've got to have everyone on board, but if your leadership is not on board, then it's probably not going anywhere. So a lot of times we start our work in districts with that leadership team and make sure they're ready, make sure they're on board before spreading the message, because sometimes you end up spreading the wrong message because it has to be connected with what schools are doing as far as school improvement. And I will tell you, if you take your school's school improvement plan and you look at the things that you want to accomplish, MTSS is going to help them. I would say 100% of the time, you are going to find a way to connect what you're doing in multi-tiered system of support, that framework, and what is on your school improvement plan. But it needs to be deliberate. We need to make sure all our systems are working towards the same end goal. And then that last piece from the guiding principles is that everything that we do needs to be culturally responsive, which means we got to know our kids, we've got to know our staff, we've got to know our community. Because what we do in one school may not work in another school. And that's just the bottom line. That's why there is no school that follows, the plan. Like if the Department of Ed could say, okay, elementary schools, here is what your schedule will look like. Here is what you're going to teach. Here's how you're going to do it. It's not going to work in every school because we all have different kids. And again, we all have different staff. And we're trying to capitalize on the resources that we have from the staff that we have. Another piece to think about is that we've got to have at least some level of core beliefs in order for this to really be an effective framework. And if you look at these four, you can probably think of the staff that you work with. Think of your colleagues. And you know that some of them are at a different point along a continuum as to how much they buy into these different beliefs. But they're all really important. We have to have a good belief that everyone is capable of learning. Everyone is capable of achieving. Not at the same level. Again, not everybody reaching every mastery of every single standard, but that we have the capability of taking a kid from point A to point B and it being meaningful, right? Growth is growth, but meaningful growth says that I'm going to end at a point that makes my life better, that makes me more capable of whatever it is that we're shooting for. But you can probably think of at least one colleague that maybe doesn't subscribe to this so much and thinks, we've got certain groups that they're going to struggle. They're going to be low. I can't do anything with them. The background that they come from, it's inevitable. They're going to end up in jail, right? That sometimes is the thinking out there. But if we can really think that we have the power, the capability to take kids forward, that has to be part of our understanding our beliefs. Number two I find this one from my background to be a little bit harder with some of the teachers that I've worked with. That we have to understand that learning is not just about academics. And especially with what we have faced during the pandemic, we get kids who are coming to us who have very low social competencies, right? The kindergarten group that we have right now may be a group of kids who have not had some of the same experiences that our kids have had in the past. They may have had mom and dad home every day, but there wasn't a lot of interaction because mom and dad were also working from home every day and the kid was on the iPad all day long or, with the TV. We have kids who have never been to church, not because parents didn't believe in church, but because you couldn't take people into a crowded setting. Kids who haven't been to daycare because there was no need for daycare, so they haven't been around other kids. We're seeing kids come in that have no idea how to sit in a seat for more than a minute at a time, and we have to teach that. In the same way that when we get a middle schooler who we expect should be able to fill out an agenda, take notes, behave themselves, the problem is if they don't have those skills, it falls back on us to teach them. And I think that's one of the things we always have to look at is when I'm not showing you a skill, is it because I don't have it and I need to be deliberately taught this? Or is it because I'm just not really good at it and it's not a fluent skill for me yet? So maybe I could do it if you tell me, I just would like to see you fill out your agenda. They may be able to actually do it, but when push comes to shove and there are all these competing things going on in the classroom and I really don't want to do it, I'm just not, right? So then it becomes more of a fluency kind of thing, which still takes us sometimes teaching and sometimes supporting to make it happen. Everyone's going to continue to move forward. Everyone has to keep learning, growing, evolving, changing what they do because our kids keep changing. The kids that you have in your classroom today are not the same group of kids you would have had 10 years ago. Even just the differences pre-social media and post-social media or I guess it's never going to be post, is it? Man. During night and day differences there. We have to keep changing what we do. We know that there's some tried and true things. There are some things about education that we never want to lose. But there are also things that have to change over time. And then every leader at every level is responsible for every kid. What happens in your primary grades affects what happens in your intermediate, middle, high. It's all connected. And so, we could say, well, we're just concerned about our circle, but that doesn't help, right? We have to make sure that we know what's going on at different levels so that we get those connections. I've had a lot of schools complain that, I have these 2 buildings. They are doing a fantastic job. They are putting things in place. They've got a lot of supports. But when they get to the intermediate, they don't do it. So those same kids who were doing great now fall apart because those things disappear. So building that continuity within your system, making sure there's some communication happening. All of those things are really important. Plus, on a more grim level, I guess, we always have that conversation about these kids are going to be the ones taking care of me when I'm old and in the nursing home. And I want to make sure that they're good kids and that they have good skills and that they, have good everything going on because it will affect me. I go into Kroger a lot of times and I'll come out some days and I'm like, this was like the best Kroger trip ever because everybody did things the right way and people were kind to each other and the shelves were well stocked and clean and all that kind of stuff. And then I have other days that I come out and think, what in the world is going on that this can't happen in a better way? I waited a half an hour to check out and when I did, the bagger, put my frozen stuff in with my bleach and, like things like that I'm like, where's the breakdown? And it all starts with school and home working together to build the community that we want to have. I'm getting into philosophy here, so let's move forward. I want you guys to have a discussion at your tables just for a minute and think about within your group, and some of you I know are in groups and some of you not so much, but that's okay. You can still have some crosstalk here. What are some of the core beliefs that your team has or your school? And how can you really keep moving this forward so that we end up with what we're looking for, which is equity, inclusion, and good practices? Okay, so just take a minute or two. All right, would anybody like to share out something that your group talked about? Knowing this is a nice, friendly group and that it's on camera. So don't say anything bad about any of your districts. What are some of the core beliefs that you felt like, you're seeing? Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of really good plans in place, but I think for us, what we are noticing is that we follow through with fidelity. We are very consistent. The team works together. That's one of the best, is that we're consistent.
And fidelity is critical.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Being consistent in your follow through is a real important thing when it comes to interventions, when it comes to data, all of the stuff that we know needs to be part of this. We have to make sure that it's happening on a regular basis. What else? Or any concerns that popped up? And I think when you're working in a cooperative where you do have multiple districts, it may not be the same, right? And it is not going to be exactly the same in every school because you're dealing with different kids, different staff, different resources, different schedule, all of that kind of stuff, even within the same district. But there has to be some level of consistency. So as these kids filter to a new level, generally you're talking about a smaller number of schools. And in many cases, you may have 2 or 3 elementaries that filter to 1 intermediate, 1 middle, high school. And there has to be some level of consistency to make that transition appropriate so that you don't have certain kids that do well and certain kids that don't. It's no different than anything else. I can remember working in it was within a co-op, but had one district that every elementary, and I think there were 3 elementaries in the district, and they were so independent of each other that we always knew that as they filtered up to intermediate school, if you came from school A, your math skills were going to be above. If you came from school B, they were going to be about right. And if you came from school C, they were going to be in the tank, right? And so the planning every year was about how do we then at intermediate, you almost ended up with groups based on what school you came from to track these kids into different instruction rather than going back and saying, look, we need to get everybody doing what works at their individual buildings so we don't end up with these huge gaps between kids. We were creating those skill gaps by allowing that to go on. And so I think one of the things with MTSS is driving it back to that core level and paying most attention to what goes on at Tier 1. All right. We're also shifting our thinking from what's wrong with this kid to what can we do? Does this kid have a disability? Does this kid have a background issue? Does this kid have, this, that, or the other, or ADHD, whatever is, to how can we manipulate things so it's going to be a better opportunity for the student to actually learn from instruction? Whether that's manipulating something in the environment, adding on a different amount of instruction, a different kind of instruction, what are all the things that we can control? Because there's so much that we can't. But the things we can control are very likely to have some impact on student performance and outcomes. And then this morning, one of the first things we talked about, really looking at that whole child approach throughout what we do. Thinking about the whole child when it comes to our Tier 1 instruction. How many of your schools have breakfast for any student who needs it? Right? We didn't used to have that. I mean, when I was growing up, you ate your breakfast at home, or if you didn't, you were hungry all morning until lunchtime. That became such an issue that we knew there were tons of kids who either didn't have breakfast, got up late and couldn't have breakfast, or, we sometimes have kids who don't eat in the morning just because they don't, and then they regret it later. And it was affecting learning. So let's get around that. Let's just feed them. Let's just feed anybody who needs to be fed. That was a universal kind of thing. It wasn't, if you are this kid from this background and this income bracket, then you got some food. It really has moved for a lot of schools to just, you're hungry, let's feed you. But it's looking at the whole child, and it's making sure that we don't try to force a kid into our system. Now, when I was working in districts as a school psychologist, I was generally on whatever the intervention team is. I mean, that's where I felt like I could make the most impact in a lot of my buildings. And some of my buildings we had in our little conference room, it was like the war room, right? And we had those cabinets that would open up with like the whiteboard behind them. And we would have data walls in there. And oh, I love data walls. They were just, I mean, it was like, it was just very appealing to me as a psychologist because I would kind of nerd out on that kind of stuff. And our teams would get like those little teeny tiny pink, yellow, and green Post-it notes to put the information on so we could move kids around. The problem was it only worked one skill set at a time. Right? If you were looking at your reading results, you had one chart. If you were looking at your math, you had a different chart. And I was maybe on a different, posted in a different area of the triangle. But even digging deeper, if we're talking about reading, yes, I could give you NWA scores, or I could give you my iLearn English Language Arts score. But it has to go deeper than that. When we're talking about intervening, is it vocabulary? Is it phonemic awareness? Is it decoding? Because my area, my score is going to be different. So it just didn't work very well, right? We could have like had this whole room with data walls for one little tiny school if we were really mapping out all of those different areas. And then we were mainly focusing on reading and a little bit of math, and that was like it. It's like, no, we can't focus on writing. Behavior, somebody else will deal with behavior. Social, emotional, the parents should have had them ready for all this before they came, right? That was just kind of the old way of thinking. So instead of trying to put a kid on a triangle, if we really think about kids as their own triangle, meaning everyone in here has got skills that you feel like, I'm good. What I get in life, the support I get, the instruction I get, the world I live in, it works. Don't really need anything else. But then you may have some things that you think, yeah, I need a little bit of extra support in this to make it happen. And those are things that fall into more of a tier 2 kind of level. You probably couldn't survive without your phone, or you think you couldn't. I know I couldn't because I do not do well with like paper calendars. Some people need paper calendars and their phone, right? And multiple alarms going off in order to make it happen. That's just different levels of support. So there may be one or two things that you have that you need some pretty intensive supports. Maybe you've hired a personal organizer to come into your house and help clean out closets, right? That's an expensive support. But we all are kind of our own triangle in that kind of thinking. So when we talk about the triangle, right, we also want to make sure that we're not trying to lock into exactly what is tier 2. When does something become tier 3? The bottom line is it doesn't matter. It's gradients of support. That's all it really is. And so for us to say, well, you've got to get through tier 3 before you can ever be evaluated, or how do you know when you're at a different level? You really don't, because it's all just relative. It's just something that gives us a visual, and we like visuals. So, okay, so this is just the graphic version only of what is on your placemat. So these are the different domains that really important. They're important for thinking about how the framework operates, gets maintained, and keeps moving us forward. So we're going to talk about each of these because they're all important. But again, I'm going to focus a lot on the tiers first, and then we're going to jump back and kind of fill in the gaps to the other things more in the afternoon. So we're going to start with the most important tier. If you write nothing else down today, Tier 1 is the most important tier. This is where most of our resources are spent for kids on any given day, right? This is what we do every day. This is what we have planned for. And Tier 1 is really thinking about absolutely everything that we do. So before your school ever opened its door, we knew bus routes to try and make them work the best way that we can for everyone, and keep travel time to a minimum and save as much money as we can and all that, keep it safe, all that kind of stuff, right? We knew how long passing periods were between classes. We mapped out the schedule. We assigned teachers to their classrooms. And there are times when you get a shakeup in a building and suddenly I'm not a 5th grade teacher anymore, I'm a 2nd grade teacher. There was a point to why that happened, not to punish someone, hopefully, but all of these things get planned out. We select textbooks. We decide whether we're going to have one-to-one technology or not. We decide whether we're going to have a classroom that has a bathroom inside of it or out of it. We built the school for a particular purpose. All of those things. School rules, the school handbook. Everything is about what we think is likely going to meet the needs of the kids that we have. It's evidence-based programs and practices, and this you're going to see a lot of repeats across the tiers because no matter what tier we're working at, this is critical that we are always using things that have a high likelihood of a good outcome because they've got some research behind them. We occasionally get people who want to show up with their shiny boxes and say, this is the latest and the greatest. And I would say, show me the research. Show me what to expect as far as an outcome. There are a lot of things that we do that don't necessarily have the greatest outcome that we might be looking for. How many of you guys have Faunus and Pinnell at your schools, right? Faunus and Pinnell has some good outcomes for certain parts of reading and some horrible outcomes for others. And so most schools that are an F&P school have to supplement for decoding instruction, because it just doesn't have good outcomes related to that. So again, whatever we pick it for a reason, and then we have to sometimes add additional things into our Tier 1 in order to make it happen. Now, what you need in your Tier 1 may change from year to year. COVID certainly made us change some of the things that we were doing at a Tier 1 level. When you get a 4th grade student who comes to you on day 1 and a good portion of your students are more at a end of 2nd grade level, you got to switch up what you're doing. Everything changes because I'm switching what I do at a tier level to meet the needs of the masses. We're going to know if this is effective if at least 80% of the kids are meeting what our expectations are. Now, 80% or what your expectations are does not need to be will pass, I learn. This takes more deliberate conversation at your grade levels to say, okay, let's see, for our kindergartners, at the end of kindergarten, what are the key skills I want to make sure that they are walking out the door with? They should be able to do this in reading, this in math, this in writing, regardless of whether they passed a test or not, but they should have these skills. Behaviorally, I would expect kindergartners should walk out that door on the last day being able to do A, B, and C. On a social emotional level, they should be able to do these things. You're not going to just be able to pick apart standards and say, standards are helpful to say what are those key standards that are just absolutely critical for moving on to the next grade level. But they're definitely not everything. And the expectations may be different depending on where you live, depending on your district. If you can get 80% of your kids there by the stuff you're doing, your Tier 1 is intact. If you can't, what we don't want to do is just start building on interventions when more kids need interventions than don't, right? We are wasting a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of resources if we try to intervene out of poor core instruction. And I don't mean bad teaching when I say poor core instruction. It just means it didn't match. It didn't meet the needs. So I'm going to shift out of the PowerPoint for a minute because none of this is in there because it's just in my head I just got back a few weeks ago from our National Association of School Psychologists Conference, and I attended so many different workshops related to what they were calling Tier 1.5, and it was very timely for all this stuff related to COVID and instruction loss and all that kind of stuff. And what they were saying was, when you get in this situation and you're like, okay, really only 40% of our kids are getting what they need from our Tier 1, then they are doing class-wide intervention. So it becomes part of what they're doing for everyone, or for at least most kids in the classroom, but they're seeing a lot of good payoff because then you have fewer kids who are needing additional intervention support once you go through a period. Usually, you're talking about a good 12 weeks of instruction is what most of the research is showing. But it's using things like peer-assisted learning strategies, using the PALS program. They had some other things that they're using as well. But having kids get additional support and instruction related usually to reading, math, sometimes social skills, but everybody's getting it. And we're just determining that, okay, this is a huge need in this class or in this school or in this grade level or in this district. And because of that, we are going to find time within that day to add in more, to add in another half an hour, 45 minutes to say, I know every time we do this, we have to give up something, right? We have to shave minutes off of something else to make it happen. But if the payoff is that a whole group shows some big improvement, then the payoff is worth it. So that's as far as I'm going to go into it because I'm going to try to design a webinar that will just cover Tier 1.5 class-wide intervention. So be on the lookout for that. So again, we're going to think about our goals here. What do we want kids to be able to do, to know, understand? Then we also have to have a sense of, okay, how do I know? How do I know that they know? What kind of data am I going to use to be able to determine that they're there? And then we also have to have a plan for if the answer is no, they haven't got it, what do I do? And the what do I do is, again, have to do with how many of our kids are not getting it. So if it's 20 or under, then you move to some interventions. If it's more than that, again, I would suggest that the whole class would benefit from more in whatever the skill set is that we need to improve. So the assessment or the data pieces that we need, this is where our universal screenings or benchmark assessments come in. So what do you guys have as far as some of the universal assessments? NWEA. So you can do NWEA 3 times a year and at least get those quick indicators of I'm fine, I'm definitely not fine, and the in-betweens, right? That we're maybe not fine, maybe fine, we're not sure yet. What else?
We use ClearSight at the middle school level.
ClearSight.
And then NWA for the elementary. We used to have NWA for middle school.
Tell me more about ClearSight. I haven't heard that.
ClearSight is more aligned to the iLearn.
Mm-hmm.
With, I mean, there's some things that I like and don't like about it, simply because it just tells you the grade level, that specific grade level that the kid is in, whereas NWA, it could tell them if they were below that or, you know, wherever their level was.
So it's not adaptive where it'll switch based on your performance.
So,
Okay.
you know, so it's just basically look at the pieces that they're missing at that grade level.
Okay. What else?
We also have a, oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was gonna say, we also have a benchmark 3 times a year for an SEL assessment that we use called DESA.
DESA. Okay. That's Devereaux.
Yeah.
Okay. Dibbles and Ames Web. So a lot of these that we've been doing for years and years. What about behavior? How do you take the pulse of your school to know if things are going okay, not so okay, or terrible on a 3-point scale there? How do you take the pulse of your school behaviorally? What data do you use?
So we use our, of course, we look at tardies. We look at how many times the kid has been sent to study rooms or been written up as an Escalon or been sent to in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, or PSA, those type of things. So we kind of look at all of that information.
So there's a lot of existing data. You didn't need a program for that. You didn't need an assessment necessarily, but you're looking at attendance, tardies, office referrals, suspensions, all of that kind of stuff. What is a source of social emotional data that already exists that you wouldn't necessarily think of, but it gets recorded in most schools every day? School nurse notes. If I'm a kid who does not want to be in reading because of an academic issue and my belly hurts every day at reading, I need to go see the nurse. That is good to know. And your nurses very quickly pick up on, there's nothing wrong with this kid. There's no fever. They never throw up, you know, whatever it is. Or if I'm a kid who social emotionally, I just need somebody to talk to and I need to get away from the chaos of the room and I'm just really stressed, a lot of headaches, a lot of belly aches. You get kids who are the frequent flyers to the nurse's office. That's one of the first places as a psychologist that I like to check is go to the school nurse and say, have you seen this kid very much? Or when you're talking about a universal screening level, they can probably just tell you, here are the kids who are maybe struggling. They also know which kids truly have medical issues, right? So they can screen out some of those kids to say, yes, I see them a lot, but here's why. A lot of good existing data, and then there are a lot of other kinds of screeners. One of the things that is, because I know like the DESA it costs. And there are a lot of things that are really good out there, but there is a cost to them. The BESS, I think, is another common one for people to use. But on the Padlet, I think it's on the very far right column of the Padlet, is one called the Student Risk Screening Scale. And it's free. Free is good, right? And there is it's one spreadsheet, but there are different tabs for elementary and secondary because it's slightly different feel. It truly is just a quick screener, and it's something that the teacher can fill out on an entire class in probably 7 minutes. Just a quick pulse of a handful of externalizing kinds of issues and a couple of internalizing kinds of issues that might be signs of something like anxiety, depression, something like that. It is not diagnostic by any means, but again, it's a quick screener, and it converts the scores of how they rate into red, yellow, and green. Woohoo, right? Makes it even easier. I just encourage you to check it out. There, again, it's just a free resource that's out there. But I would also encourage you to check in with your school district and see what their guidance is on collecting any kind of screening data like that. And do we need to have parents opt in or opt out and all that kind of good stuff. So, all right. Evidence-based score instruction again, and implementation with fidelity. So no matter what we're doing, if we are doing it halfway, we shouldn't expect the same result. Doesn't mean you're not going to miss what you do instructionally every now and then. We have fire drills, we have snow days, we have COVID days, you know, all of this kind of stuff. But if I, as my core instruction, am using some sort of a program or a method that should be done in this particular way, and it should be done at least 4 days a week for this many minutes, and I'm trying to crunch it into a 45-minute period and it doesn't really fit, so I'm probably leaving something out or going really fast on something. You know, if I'm not following it the way the research said should produce these results, you can't expect the same results. And so that's one of the things that we really should look for during principal walkthroughs. What's happening? Are we doing it right? I was in a school one time on a site visit, and the school had really been struggling with the reading performance of all their students. And so we were just doing teacher interviews to see if we could kind of get to the bottom of it. And I remember having 3 different interviews with 3 different first grade teachers, all in the same hallway, in the same school building. And what we found out was that they were given, here's your core series, right, that you're going to be using. Here's the curriculum that you're using. But they were told, but you have the freedom to do what you want. So teacher A was using it, you know, religiously and following everything, implementing with fidelity. Teacher B was using pieces and parts of it and supplementing with other things. And teacher C said, I don't really like it, so I'm doing something different. You can't expect the same results from that program for the 3 different groups because they're not getting the same thing. So looking again for not everything needing to be scripted, but making sure that whatever we do, that we're doing it the way it should be done. We're doing it with fidelity. Okay, so here is what I want you to do. We're going to take about 5 minutes, and you've got those big sheets, right? On one side of the sheet, it says evidence-based practices, and one side of the sheet says evidence-based assessments. So what I want you to think about is across those different areas, across academics, behavior, and social emotional, first map out what is going on at Tier 1. We are only dealing with Tier 1 right now. What is happening at your building, or if you're at a district, just thinking kind of in a more general way, for Tier 1 instruction, and what is happening as far as gathering that universal benchmarking data in those different areas. Okay, so again, just Tier 1. So take about 5 minutes to work on that. So what did you notice by this activity, by completing some of this? I know, again, some of you are district level, and so it's harder to think about a building, right? It's harder to think about exactly what's going on. But what did you notice from doing this? What was harder, practices or assessments to complete? Practices. Almost with every group I've ever worked with. And a lot of times when I go into districts and kind of do some walkthroughs and just start asking, a random teacher, what are you doing at a tier 1 level for behavioral instruction? They're like, what do you mean? I have Class Dojo. I'm like, no, that's an assessment kind of piece. What are you doing instructionally? It's hard to put it into words, right? You do so many good things every day. It's hard to weave it all together to say, this is deliberately what I am doing at a tier 1 level. And so I think having that conversation sometimes brings our attention to the stuff that we do, which is celebratory, woohoo, we're doing all this great stuff. But other times it's also realizing that maybe I'm not teaching that. Maybe it's just happening, but I don't really know why. But things are going okay. From completing this, are there any areas that you felt like there's some holes? Okay, where? What's missing? Some of the assessment pieces. Now let's talk about assessment for just a minute. We do a lot of assessment, right? You feel like you're assessing all the time. And we're constantly assessing. The big issue is, can I pull my assessment together to where I can use it to make decisions? I know what's going on. We also have a lot of repetitive assessment. I test with this, I found these results. I test with this other instrument, it gave me the same results. They're measuring the same thing. I hope we're getting the same results, right? We do a lot of things that just confirm what we already knew. So we have lots of students that I don't need an assessment, it's like absence of data sometimes tells me that certain kids are fine in this area. I also have kids that I don't need an assessment in order to tell me that they're struggling in this area, right? It's the gray area kids that we need more intensive data on. We also need to make sure that we use the data. If we're going to collect the data, it needs to be used somehow. So it needs to be organized in a fashion that we can actually use it. Whether it's entered into our more comprehensive data system for the school, whether it's somewhere in your student information system, whether it's a program that gives teachers easy access to be able to look at their whole class on something, or for administrators to be able to look at grade level by grade level or school by school. Those things are very helpful. They tend to be pricey, unless you have someone within your district that can build that kind of a system, and some districts do. Questions about Tier 1 before we jump into Tier 2?
Here are some of the examples of other schools of their Tier 1.
Sure. Do you guys want to just share a little bit? So for example, did anybody have anything specific written in what your Tier 1 looks like for reading?
For reading,
Uh-huh.
I know we do the core curriculum for elementary is FFP. That's what they have been trained on, and they do guided reading for every group. So that's what our elementary skills are doing.
Okay. What about some other people? What was your Tier 1?
We use EL education.
Okay. Tell me about that one a little bit. I don't know that one.
Well, maybe you can help.
So basically, it is really pushing the students with the reading component, but then also the writing component. And the stories are coming from a variety of backgrounds and platforms. Because what we were finding is that some of the stories were not relatable to the students that we serve in our population because we have such a diverse population. We've been very pleased with this program.
So culturally responsive, right?
Culturally responsive, and then really pushing the modifications were really not, we're not modifying this curriculum. The curriculum needs to be scaffolded for our students that are special needs or ESL or just maybe struggling learners, but pushing teachers to use what is there because that's what they're going to be exposed to in their state assessments.
Good.
Can you say what it is again?
EL,
Do you know what it stands for?
I should.
I'm sure we can Google it.
I
but-
think that's.
I will find out. Hold on, let me text the director of curriculum.
Okay. What about Tier 1 instruction, Tier 1 practices for social emotional?
We use responsive classroom and second steps.
Okay. Responsive classroom and second steps. What else?
We can source the strengths for secondary.
Sources of strength? Is that a program or?
Suicide prevention program.
Okay. All right, so it's going to be different depending on whether you're talking about secondary, whether you're talking about elementary, and then whether just what's going on at your school. What are the issues that we are trying to protect against and or build up based on what we know about our population? Anybody else for social emotional?
So we have a, building-wide JAG jam
Okay.
sort of thing. It's, like 20 minutes in the morning as the students are coming in. We have like a JAG TV thing where we hear like the announcements, but after that, the students are in groups based on things that they chose to learn about. And then we also have a period where we're going through social emotional learning topics with our students and having those discussions and things like that. So we started that last year. We've done a little bit more of it this year. So we hope to try to expand on that as the years to come.
Yeah.
So,
So let me give you a good but also a non-example. On a recent walkthrough with the school corporation, they were doing Tier 1 support for social emotional learning and related to behavior too, because there's a lot of overlap between those two areas. And they were doing this at I believe this was at a middle school, may have been at the high school as well. But it was designed by the school counselors, and they were coming up with, so during that homeroom or whatever they called it time at the beginning of the day, there was a lesson with an activity, and the school counselors were coming up with this, and it didn't happen every day, but it happened on a kind of a regular basis. And so the directions were given to every teacher of, here's something fun to get kids to work together, to have some conversations, so relationship building, but it was also focused on a particular skill or a particular attribute. So whether it was the day that I went, the underlying concept was about perseverance, right? So it was teaching kids to work together, but also even when things got frustrating, they were to keep going. And it was something very simple. They were throwing ping pong balls into a trash can, so didn't even need to buy anything other than a ping pong ball. But they were throwing them into a trash can in various ways. So it started with one person, how many can you throw into the trash can from here? And then the next person had to do it backwards and over their head. I mean, it was like lots of variations of that. And so it was also a class-to-class competition. Beautiful thing, right? So I walk into a classroom and I'm seeing the kids interact. They're interacting with the teacher. It was great. I go into another classroom. They're doing it a little bit differently, but they're still doing it, and it was great. I go into another classroom, and I have a teacher who's sitting at his desk. He's on his phone. And I stood there for probably 5 minutes before even getting a, oh, hi, right? And then suddenly it was, oh, I think we have an activity to do. So finding out later, when we get back to looking at fidelity, that was a beautiful intervention. And it was set up to meet the needs of the student body, but it was also optional. And if it's optional, your fidelity goes out the window because it's not happening for everyone, which means if I happen to be in that teacher's class, I'm not getting access to that good stuff that everybody else is getting access to. I'm not focusing on the skill. Any particular ones that you guys wanted to hear about, like areas or anything else? Okay, so here is just an example, and it's not perfect, but this was a first blush kind of attempt from a school district, and this is what they filled out. And it was more on a district level. It was the district team saying, what do we got going at all the different levels? But you'll notice it's really on a gradient. Like, I can't always say that certain things are tier 2, tier 3, and maybe I use those same things as tier 1 when the whole class needed them. It would be more of a just building it into what I do for everyone. But what do you notice from this? What's the first thing that sticks out when you look at this? Right, because that's what, as schools, that's what our primary focus has been for years and years and years, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? We've got to teach that piece, and so we know lots of different things. A little less on behavior, social emotional. Sometimes we get a little scared about even addressing social emotional.
They're all under academic too, so they really do all.
Right. The overlap is there. I mean, so many of these things you see repeated because they truly affect all of these different things. And sometimes you can't even get to the academic unless you're dealing with some of the other stuff. Now, here's something else that they found out. This is all the stuff that they could come up with that they were doing that they felt like fit into the practices for tier 1, 2, and 3. You know there's other stuff that they're doing that never made it onto the list because it was just such a natural part of what they did that they didn't even think about it making the list. But the next step would be to kind of go through and say what's working and what's not. Having more doesn't necessarily mean better. It just means you're doing more. Having options is great, but just having more sometimes creates chaos in the system. So it's finding out what can we connect this to data-wise to say it's paying off, it's worth the effort, it's worth the time. All right, so we are going to talk about tier 2, and I'd imagine we'll probably be talking about tier 2 up until about the point of lunch. So some things to know that are important, these key words. Tier 2 is supplemental, meaning it's not in place of. So I've had some people say, well, if I'm going to give instruction in a special ed classroom instead of in the regular classroom, then that's kind of a tier 2 support. No, that's a tier 1 support in a different room. No matter, don't ever connect tiers to a place or a person. If it is my core instruction in something, that is tier 1, no matter who gave it or what room it was in. Okay? So we are saying, I'm giving you the core in whatever this is, and it wasn't enough, so we're going to add on something supplemental. It also needs to be targeted. And this is really important. If we don't target to a particular skill, we may, and I really do mean may, because sometimes, yes, we see good improvements, but we may not see the kind of improvement that we're looking for if we're using something that is supplemental, but it's very much a kind of a mixture of focusing on a lot of different things. And a lot of times, I see this a lot in Title I, and Title I is a great thing. I don't want to give the impression that I think that it's not good. Title I is great, but much of the Title I support that I've seen is kind of a package program particularly in reading, that hits like skills from all different angles. That is what some kids need. Some kids just need more of the same, right? But for a lot of our kids, what we're looking at is figuring out kind of on a diagnostic level, what is it that they're truly struggling with so that we don't waste time. So, for example, if say I'm a kid with reading fluency issues. Decoding, I'm fine. Phonemic awareness, I got it. Probably my comprehension's not very good because my fluency is not very good. But at a base level, when we're thinking about the basic skill to attack, if fluency is not good, that's where we would start. Now, if, say, for example, I'm getting 30 minutes of supplemental instruction every single day, 5 days a week, but it's kind of a global thing, then it sounds like on the surface we have 150 minutes of supplemental instruction, but we don't have 150 minutes of supplemental targeted instruction. If out of that 30 minutes every day, really as an individual person in this group, I'm only getting maybe, say at best, 2 minutes of out loud reading time with some feedback, something that would increase my fluency, suddenly now I've gone from 150 minute a week intervention to a 10 minute a week fluency intervention. Big difference on what you would expect on my fluency. You may see a little bit of global impact on my reading, right? Because we're hitting from all angles. But as far as my fluency, if I'm using a fluency assessment, probably not going to see a lot of change in that student. So the more that we can target, the better. Now, let's think of the chaos that this creates. I want to be a realist when it comes to this stuff. If I'm a classroom teacher and I've got 25 kids in my room teaching second grade, so I've got some kids struggling with phonemic awareness, some kids struggling with phonics, some kids struggling with fluency, some kids struggling with behavior, and not just within behavior. Let's target in behavior, right? Some kids who have a lot of trouble with organization, others that are struggling with verbal aggression, right? There are a lot of different things going on, or managing frustration, or all of those different things happening. And you tell me I've got to potentially provide tier 2 support in all of these different areas, I'm probably going to quit, right? Because how do you do that? Where do you fit it in? How do you make it happen? Well, part of that is really getting that good tier 1, right? So we eliminate as many of these things as possible, but it's also making sure that we connect with the services and supports that are available within the building. So if we have an intervention time, whether it's the win time, what I need time, or some people just have, they even call it, MTSS time or whatever during the day, whatever is carved out, if during that time, the few kids across the third or second graders who are struggling with phonics, they come to me. The few kids that are struggling across classrooms with phonemic awareness go to Mrs. Jones, and the other kids go in here for fluency. Everybody goes to what they need, as opposed to me as an individual teacher trying to meet the needs of everyone for every possible targeted area. So you got to share the love, right? And make sure that we're coordinating that. It's going to be really hard to coordinate that if you don't have some identified time and some good communication happening across grade levels. I have some schools that intervention time happens throughout the day, but by any available person who has the free time to do it. So they're using a lot of their specials teachers to say, when you're not teaching specials, because we don't need you at every single period, you are providing these different groups. You've got to use the resources that you do have, because what you aren't going to have is more money for more people to hire, right? And if you did, you probably wouldn't have a room to put them in to be able to do the work that they need. So as you're building what you're going to do at Tier 2, you want to think about creating a toolbox. And I would encourage you to build a toolbox that is comprehensive enough to meet the different needs that you anticipate, right? There's always going to be a new need that comes up that you're like, well, we haven't seen this one before. What are we going to do? And you're thinking on the fly about, a group or an instructional practice or something that is going to meet the needs. But you're creating a toolbox that you think is going to be needed with enough choice that it will likely, you'll be able to find a match for the student, but not so many choices that nobody is good at any of them. If you get too many options for things that you could do, like if you have, 7 different decoding kinds of interventions, nobody becomes an expert at any of them, right? You want maybe 2 options related to this, because the one may not fit, but if they're 2 good ones, you're likely to find something that is gonna work. And you can create those resource supports within your building to say, if you're gonna try this, Mr. Smith is the person to go to. He's the expert. He can help with support on this. He's not gonna do it for you necessarily, but he is the person that is the go-to person. So, and I told this story before, but in my house, we have 2 toolboxes, right? Got a little one, it's very nice. It's got my basics. It's got a hammer, it's got a flathead, it's got a Phillips head screwdriver, it's got an adjustable wrench, some needle nose pliers, right? You've got the basic things that I know I'm gonna need, and I know how to use those tools, like every one of them. I know what to do with them and what not to do with them. And then my husband has this big yellow toolbox, and I swear if I stick my hand down in to try and find something, I'm probably going to get cut because there's so many things in there, and I don't even know what half of them do. Like, what are channel locks for? I don't know, and I'm probably never going to use them, right? And every variety of screwdriver, and some of them are metric and some of them are not, and it's overwhelming. Like, I don't even want to get in that toolbox. And I think that's kind of how we feel sometimes when we're talking about interventions. If we've got this big intervention manual and we're told to go to the manual, open it up and find what you're going to do, like as if we're just going to blindly pick something, there's likely going to be a lot of stuff in there that really isn't evidence-based. And there's likely going to be a lot of stuff in there that nobody has used in the last 5 years, and nobody who still works here even knows how to do it or could model it for me, right? Which is a lot of what we need. Just show me how to do it so I know I'm doing it right. That fidelity piece is important. Okay, a little bit different in how we look at whether or not this is good stuff. We're going to know that what we're doing at a Tier 2 level, if the number of kids that we put into it, right, which we know should be somewhere less than 20% in any given area, if somewhere 70 to 80% or more of those kids are moving forward and showing improvement, bottom line, it's a very rough kind of estimate. But I mean, if you're putting something in place at Tier 2 and you're only seeing about 20% of the kids who get it even really making improvement, it's not the right one, right? It's not the right thing to put your time and effort and money into, and we want to get rid of that. So if we're asking some general questions, these questions really are all about dosage. So I mentioned before, there's no hard and fast line that says, I was in Tier 2, now I crossed this line and I'm now receiving Tier 3. It's a blur. It really doesn't matter. It is all about, am I getting enough to move me forward? Am I getting what I need? And so if we start by thinking, this is kind of like writing an IEP, right? We start with present levels. Where am I now? Am I a little behind? Am I a lot behind? Looking at what's the goal for where do we want a student to be. There's no magic to this. There's nothing that says if we start to do interventions, you are going to catch up by the end of the year, by the end of the quarter, whatever. We have to also think about what's been my pattern along the way? What's been my rate of improvement in that area over time? If I am moving at a snail's pace, we want to get you there faster. If I'm already moving at a pretty good pace, but so are my peers naturally, and I just don't ever seem to be closing the gap at all, we've got to ramp it up more. So even though that rate looks okay, if it's never going to help close the gap, we've got to have a faster rate if we want to start closing that gap. So we may ask, okay, how critical is this skill now? How long do I have to get you from point A to point B so that it's meaningful? So if I have a third grader and you come to me and say, okay, I just got this new kid in my class, they're reading at a first grade level. That's critical, right? That's immediate, oh my gosh, we have got to take action. We've got to get this kid moving at a faster rate because I don't want them leaving my building being behind or far behind. I at least want to make up some of that ground because it's gonna kick in forever. But if you come to me and say, I have an 11th grader who's reading at an 8th grade level, that's even further behind. It's not quite as critical, right? Other than the sense that I only have them for another year. So what can I accomplish during that time? The answers aren't super clear as far as, what's more pressing. It really is based on an individual child and kind of what their pathway is, and are we moving them towards a career, college, any of that stuff? What are those critical skills that we want to focus on? And for many of them, some of those critical skills happen to be the behavioral and social emotional things that will get you fired. So it's not just about, am I going to get kicked out of school for a day, but it's about, if you did this at your job, you would not have a job. And those are critical, critical life skills. So if we think about what their current rate of improvement is in any area and how fast of a rate do we need in order to get them to whatever goal that we've set, then we determine, again, it's kind of like an IEP. It's like figuring out what services are going to help you reach your goals. It's the same thing when we're talking about interventions and support and instruction. How much medicine will it take to get you over whatever this is, to move you forward? Not easy questions, they really aren't. But if we can start having these conversations at our meetings, rather than we're going to set the same goals that we set for everyone, which is we want you at grade level, we want you at grade level, then we never know what to do. But if we can set very specific goals, then it's going to make it more meaningful. Now, because this is more, we're expending resources here on top of what we would do for everyone else, we need to ramp up the assessment. We've got to have more data. At minimum, in the research world, and this is truly minimum, and there are a lot of people who will say, you're crazy, you need a lot more than this, but you need at least 4 to 6 data points even to get a trend line in data. And until you have a trend line, seeing some ups and downs is pretty meaningless, right? So we want to have a good trend line with your data. I would say really, 8 to 12 data points would be my personal minimum of that's really what I'm looking for. And the more the better, as long as it's meaningful. So when we're collecting assessment data, the general rule of thumb for Tier 2 is you want at least monthly data. At least. And you also want to make sure that whatever tool that you're using to progress monitor if you have a targeted intervention, so again, let's go back to reading fluency. If I'm in a reading fluency support, I want a reading fluency measure. A global reading measure is not going to really tell me a lot about my rate of reading. In the same way, a lot of the data that we use for things like behavior and social emotional, like office referrals, right? I could have made a dent in a student's skill, but I may see one less office referral than I did the last month or whatever. It's not really going to be sensitive to those small changes. So think about, in a lot of behavioral and social emotional areas, your best bet is to figure out what skill that you've been working on and find a way to track it. Hash marks, daily checks, things like that. You're not talking about an assessment tool that's, something you would purchase necessarily. Keep a chart of these particular things. If we're looking at, during a half an hour class period that we just randomly designate, and you're looking at how many times can I get the kid to actually raise their hand and participate in conversation. It's not a test. It's not, that kind of a tool. It's me as a teacher moving one penny to the other pocket, just so that I can keep track of those things, and then having some data, having some comparison. So again, needs to be evidence-based instructional practices, and they need to be implemented with fidelity. Now, one thing that I think, it's not a rule, it's not anything hard and fast, but it's something that I would suggest to keep you from going crazy and from depleting all your resources, is to try to focus your meetings at the Tier 2 level on the problem and not the student. If you can use existing teaming structures, grade level teams, instructional content area teams, whoever is already meeting, and instead of having a meeting on Jimmy, and then 20 minutes later we have a meeting on Sally, and going through the hoops of every kid that we have concerns about, if as a teaching team we get together and say, what are the issues? I've got several kids with reading fluency issues. Okay, let's build an intervention, and then we plug the kids into it. It's going to save time, it's going to save resources, and again, because you're building things that could then have different kids flowing in and out of them, you're not wasting time on the details of an individual person and reconstructing their team every time at Tier 2. Tier 3 is a different story. So we're going to shift once we get to that point, but at Tier 2, problem solve the issues, not the students. Does that make sense? Okay, now shifting back to that thinking of the whole child though, there is kind of a layer of, as we plug kids into those different supports, knowing what we know about the student, we may have to make some adjustments. So for example, if we have, say we have a student who is struggling with reading, really struggling with reading comprehension. The skills are there, but the reading comprehension is not there. I think with an old system, we would have had a meeting on her. We would have figured out, where we want to focus, and then maybe design a plan specifically for her, plug her into that. Great, okay? By problem solving the issues, if we find that we have more kids who are struggling with reading comprehension, then we can also plug her into that. Now, let's take a look at her on an individual level. And if I, as her teacher, can tell you that, yes, she's struggling, but she misses my class. It's my first class of the day. She misses it at least one day a week, or at least part of that class, because she's late to school. And I've heard that mom and dad are having problems, right? They're struggling at home. They are fighting all the time. She says she doesn't sleep well at night. half the time when she does show up on time, she either hasn't had breakfast or she's putting her head down because she's really tired. I know a lot more about this student from that whole child kind of perspective. And what I'm not going to want to do is say, okay, we're going to put some things in place just for reading. Or I'm not going to put anything in place that is right at the beginning of the day because she's likely to not benefit from it because she may not be here. She's missing a lot of that time. I may be looking for some support that's available in the afternoon. That might be better for her. I also may think that, boy, it's not really about the reading. Her mind's not really here with us sometimes when she's in the classroom. Maybe it's social emotional supports that I need to be thinking about. So you're going to have to tweak some things on that individual level, even when you are problem solving issues, right? Because you don't just plug them in because I got the score that puts me in here, and sometimes that's what we do. You, with these scores here and below, you go here, and you go here, and we just kind of plug kids in that way without thinking about, you had that score, that's not consistent with everything else I'm seeing on a daily basis. Maybe that's not worth the time. So we want to make sure that whatever we're providing at that tier 2 and tier 3 level, well, and for a lot of places it's at the tier 1 level as well, is that we're using every minute that we can targeted to that skill so that we're not wasting time reviewing what you already know. If I already know it, it really shouldn't be part of the intervention, which is why we target it to the particular skill. Questions or thoughts about tier 2? Okay, we're going to take some time now, go back to your sheets and back to your teams, and think about what do we have practice-wise and assessment-wise in those different areas for tier 2. So we're going to take about 10 minutes to do that. We'll take about 5 minutes to debrief that, and then we'll be heading to lunch. What are some things academically that your schools are using for tier 2 for different academic areas? What are some of the practices? I heard OG mentioned when I was wandering around, Orton Gillingham.
Fire.
Okay.
Imagine learning pathways.
What else?
Rise.
RISE, R-I-S-E. Okay. What else?
We have LLI.
Okay.
We have WID time. For our middle school, we have Read 180. We also have homework help after school. We do Alex as well.
Alex, or a lot of those different IXL, Alex, lots of different computer-based kind of programs too. What about?
We're looking at structures for the secondary level, just from brainstorming.
And when we get done with tier 3, I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about, oh my gosh, what do we do at secondary? Because secondary is a harder application, and it's different, right? You're probably not going to have a phonemic awareness group happening for your juniors and seniors, although some of them still struggle with that skill, right? But yeah, we will. I promise we'll get there on that one too. Social emotional. What are some of the things happening?
Social groups.
Social groups. I heard check in, check out.
2 by 10.
2 by 10. Love 2 by 10. 2 by 10 is amazing, and it's free, right? Gotta love the free stuff. And there's so many other benefits than just what you're focused on, just that relationship building. What else? And write down what you hear other people saying. Add them to your sheets so that you can go back and look at them. Look at the research behind them. See, are they likely to fit for your population? Mentors. Yeah. A lot of things that you can do with peers or mentoring for, a staff to student kind of mentor relationship. Behaviorally. Anything different for behavior? Again, I know there's a ton of overlap between social emotional supports and behavioral supports.
We want to do a lunch brunch,
Okay?
where kids are having some difficulties, but we're working on teaching skills, and then we're working with them, building up a relationship at lunch instead of making it like you get lunch attention, it's more of a lunch brunch.
It's more of a positive, right? Lunch brunch. I like that. What else? And really thinking about not behavior in general. Like, I mean, I've had some people say, well, we have in-school suspension. Well, what are we teaching there, right? Think about, are there specific behavioral kinds of things that you're seeing a need and we're filling that need by using this practice?
We're trying to move more towards those restorative practices.
Restorative. Yeah. Okay. Keep searching out there. Because as you go back to your schools and start having some conversations with other people, you may find that there are pockets of people doing amazing things that the rest of the school doesn't know about. It's like, in my classroom, I do this for this select group of kids because I know they need it. They're like, oh my gosh, please teach everyone that, because there's some good things happening that aren't necessarily happening on a global kind of scale, and other people just may not know what's going on. Assessment-wise, just quickly on that. Harder at Tier 2, isn't it? Right? Again, for a lot of the assessment pieces, the data that we're bringing in, you're probably going to be constructing those on a kid by kid or a group by group, intervention by intervention basis to say, here's what we're targeting, so here's how I'm going to count it, assess it, so that I've got some data to tell me, keep doing it, stop doing it, do something different. You know, we're always basically asking the same kind of thing. Do I need more of this? Is it working? Is it somewhat working? Or is it not really giving me any kind of outcome that I'm looking for?